Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by trackpads.com. Each week, we take one pivotal moment from United States military history and follow it from the first warning signs to the final outcome. Today we go to the Central Pacific in the Second World War for the story of the Battle of Midway. Just after first light on June 4, 1942, the Pacific east of Midway Atoll looked strangely quiet. The sea rolled in long gray swells, broken only by the wakes of 3 American carriers and their escorts pushing through the thin morning haze. On the flight decks of Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, deck crews in colored jerseys and float coats hurried between bomb-laden dive bombers and torpedo planes. They waved chocks into place, checked tie-downs, and signaled as engines coughed and settled into a steady roar. Word had come from Midway's scout planes that an enemy force lay somewhere to the northwest. Yet no one on those decks had actually seen a single Japanese ship. It was a calm surface laid over real danger. Inside the carriers, in island combat information centers and flag plots, the picture was only a little clearer. Plotters slid colored markers across a large chart table, turning scattered reports and radio bearings into a rough track of the Japanese advance. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance studied that shifting pattern and weighed each new fragment, aware that somewhere beyond the horizon sailed the same carrier force that had smashed American air power at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The sense of unfinished business hung over every decision. To the west, aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's aircrews were recovering from their first strike on Midway's airfields and preparing for whatever would come next. Both sides were busy, but neither yet had a full picture. High above that gray ocean, American scout planes pushed outward in long, thin arcs. Crews hunched over navigation boards and drift sights, scanning the empty sea below for the smallest sign of a mast or a wake. Each pilot knew that a single sighting and a clear contact report could bring the full weight of the United States carrier force crashing down on the enemy. Each also knew that if they failed, Japanese air groups would soon be coming the other way, hunting the very ships that had launched them. The Battle of Midway, at that tense and uncertain dawn, balanced on a few lines of radio code and the fuel in a handful of search planes. The blaze that would later consume 4 Japanese carriers still lay hidden behind clouds, distance, and a race to find the other side first. To understand why that quiet dawn mattered so much, it helps to pull back from the spray on those carrier decks and look at a wider map of the Pacific in mid-1942. In the months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire had surged across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific in a series of explosive offensives. Japanese forces seized Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and a string of island bases that pushed their defensive perimeter ever outward. The United States Pacific Fleet, bloodied at Pearl Harbor and forced into a long retreat from the Philippines, was still rebuilding its strength. At that moment, only its carriers and a patchwork of cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and shore bases stood between Japan and a deeper push toward Hawaii and the American West Coast. It was a fragile shield. Midway Atoll, a small speck of coral northwest of Hawaii, suddenly became far more than a dot on a chart. With its airstrips and its seaplane base, it sat at the outer edge of the Hawaiian defense line like a forward outpost. If Japan could seize or neutralize Midway, its forces could threaten Hawaii from closer range and extend their scouting and striking power across the Central Pacific. Japanese planners saw the operation as a way to draw what remained of the United States fleet into battle on Japanese terms. In their view, a crushing victory near Midway could finish what Pearl Harbor had started by destroying American carrier strength in one decisive stroke. One atoll became the focus of a huge ocean. For the United States Navy, the stakes were just as stark and unforgiving. Lose the carriers at Midway, and there would be no quick way to stop further Japanese advances across the Pacific Islands and sea lanes. Hawaiian defenses would suddenly look thin. Morale at home, already shaken by months of bad news, would take another sharp blow. Victory, on the other hand, could blunt Japan's momentum, protect the Central Pacific approaches, and buy time for American industry to turn ambitious shipbuilding and aircraft production plans into real combat power at sea. That contrast shaped every choice. This is why Spruance's carriers had sailed from Pearl Harbor into what everyone knew was, on paper, a Japanese plan. The idea was to turn that plan back on its authors and catch Nagumo off balance instead. As dawn broke on June 4th, the apparent calm on deck and the empty sea beyond hit a deep gamble about who would see whom first and who would strike first. The answer to that question would determine who held the initiative in the Pacific War for years to come. That quiet morning was the narrow hinge of a long conflict. The calm surface at dawn was only the hinge. To see how that moment came to be, you have to go back months earlier to quiet rooms far from the ocean where United States Navy codebreakers worked. There, specialists pored over streams of Japanese radio traffic, sorting signals, patterns, and call signs into something they could understand. Over time, they became convinced that the next major Japanese move would be against a target labeled AF. It was careful, patient work. To prove it, Midway's garrison sent an uncoded report complaining about a broken water distillation plant. Soon, intercepted Japanese messages mentioned water shortages at AF, confirming that Midway was the objective and giving Admiral Chester Nimitz something Japan believed it still possessed, which was surprise. Even with that precious insight, Nimitz faced hard limits on what he could commit into danger. The Pacific Fleet had only 3 operational carriers in reach: Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, which had just limped back from the Battle of the Coral Sea. Shipyard crews swarmed over Yorktown in a frantic repair effort, shoring up bulkheads, patching her flight deck, and restoring enough machinery to send her back to sea in days rather than months. It was a race against the calendar. While welders worked below decks, staff officers labored through the night to plan a concentration of all 3 carriers northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the horizon where Japanese scouts were least likely to search. The idea was to put a hidden fist in the ocean, ready to strike first. On the other side of the Pacific, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and his planners were building something more complex. They designed an operation in which a diversionary force would strike the Aleutian Islands to pull American attention north, while Nagumo's carrier strike force approached Midway from the northwest. Behind this spearhead sailed battleships and heavy cruisers, ready to finish any surviving American ships that stumbled into range. Japanese doctrine still assumed that carrier air groups and big surface guns, used together, could force a decisive battle that would cripple the United States fleet. Confidence ran high. Crucially, Japanese leaders believed American carriers would arrive late, if they appeared at all. As both sides moved into place, Nimitz accepted that he was sailing directly into an enemy plan, but he trusted that foreknowledge from his codebreakers and careful positioning could flip that plan on its head. On the morning of June 4th, the first heavy blows at Midway did not come from the American carriers at all, but from the atoll itself. Japanese aircraft lifted off from Nagumo's carriers in the pre-dawn darkness and struck Midway's runways and fuel stores, cratered the coral, and set fires that pushed dark smoke into the sky. Midway's defenders, flying everything from Marine Corps fighters to torpedo bombers and Army heavy bombers, launched piecemeal attacks against the incoming formation. It was a rough, uneven defense. Those pilots dove bravely into walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of nimble Japanese fighters, scoring little damage but forcing Nagumo to think hard about a second strike on the island. Reports from these attacks, combined with sightings from long-range patrol planes, confirmed for the Americans at sea that they had indeed located the main carrier force. Out on Enterprise and Hornet, air groups launched in hurried waves as their squadrons fanned out into the vastness of the Central Pacific along planned search and attack tracks. Navigation errors, weather, and the sheer size of the search area scattered these groups across hundreds of miles of ocean. Torpedo squadrons from each carrier flying slow, vulnerable aircraft were the ones that found the Japanese first. They flew low and straight because they had to. One after another, they pressed in at wave-top height, straight and level, through fighter screens and concentric rings of gunfire that tore into their formations. Squadron after squadron was cut to pieces, torpedoes dropped too far out or failed in the water, and very few weapons made it close to the Japanese hulls. For long minutes, the sacrifice looked like nothing but loss. Yet those doomed attacks had powerful effects on the shape of the battle. They dragged the Japanese combat air patrol down toward the wave tops, where fighters chased torpedo planes across the sea, and they pulled the formation of defending aircraft out of its neat, layered patterns. On the carrier decks below, crews still worked around fueled and armed aircraft, spotting and respotting planes for different missions as orders changed. It was a busy, dangerous scene. While that was happening, another group of American aircraft was closing in from higher altitude. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, delayed and redirected by incomplete reports and last-minute course changes, finally spotted a cluster of wakes and small dots on the horizon that could only be ships. Guided by a contact report from a lone scout plane, the dive bomber leaders swung their formations into position and pushed in from the direction of the sun. The pilots knew they were almost out of time and fuel. As they descended, they saw below them what they had hoped for, and feared they might never find. 3 Japanese carriers with flight decks crowded by aircraft and ordnance. Those decks were full of opportunity and danger. Each pilot picked a target as the carriers. Wakes curved white against the blue water, anti-aircraft fire reaching up to meet them. In those seconds, the scattered pieces of the morning's action suddenly came together over one patch of ocean. When the American dive bombers rolled over into their steep attack dives, the Japanese fleet below was caught at an almost uniquely vulnerable moment. Fighters were low, far out on the edges of the formation or out of position after chasing earlier attackers. Deck crews were in the middle of rearming and refueling planes for another strike, with hoses, bombs, and torpedoes scattered across exposed hangar spaces. It was a dangerous tangle of steel and fuel. Bombs and torpedoes sat exposed on hangar decks rather than stowed safely behind armor. In a matter of minutes, well-placed bomb hits turned Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu into burning wrecks. With their wooden flight decks shattered, hangars aflame, and damage control teams quickly overwhelmed. Smoke rose in towering columns from the stricken carriers as explosions tore through their interiors. The heart of Japan's veteran carrier striking force was being ripped open before the eyes of shocked sailors. Only the carrier Hiryu remained operational, turning away to open the range and launch counterstrikes of her own against the American task force. One ship still fought back. The battle that had begun as a carefully laid Japanese plan was now lurching into a far more desperate phase, with both sides reeling from losses and the final outcome still undecided. Midway had moved from theory and planning into a brutal test of endurance. As smoke rose from the ruined carriers, the battle around Midway entered its most fragile phase. In a brief stretch around mid-morning, the war in the Pacific pivoted on timing, eyesight, and human decisions. When the American dive bombers had peeled out of the sun and slammed their bombs into Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, they did more than damage 3 hulls. They had torn into the heart of Japan's experienced carrier striking force in a single, concentrated blow. Hangar decks packed with fueled aircraft and stacked ordnance had become fire traps in seconds. It all changed very quickly. Those hangars, carefully arranged for a second strike on Midway or a clash with the American carriers, became traps once fire and blast ripped through them. Explosions rolled through compartments that had been filled with planes, fuel lines, and munitions instead of empty safety spaces. Veteran pilots, irreplaceable deck crews, and the air groups that had led Japan's early war victories were suddenly gone or fighting for their lives on burning decks. For the Japanese, it felt like years of investment disappearing in a single hour. Yet the turn at Midway was not a neat, one-sided punch. One ship still carried the fight. Hiryu, the one surviving Japanese carrier still able to operate aircraft, launched furious counterattacks as soon as she could spot and arm planes. Her dive bombers and torpedo aircraft found Yorktown and hit her hard, punching holes in the flight deck, starting fires, and knocking out power long enough to stop the carrier dead in the water. The shock on Yorktown was intense, with smoke, flames, and a frightening list to one side. American damage control teams went to work with hoses, shoring timbers, and quick improvisation, battling heat and choking fumes to keep the ship alive. One short burst of discipline and training kept her from dying outright. Their work paid off in ways that reached beyond one hull. Yorktown's crew managed to bring the carrier back to life long enough to restore some mobility and flight deck function, which confused Japanese aviators into thinking they had struck 2 separate American carriers rather than one that had been partly restored. That misreading added fog to Japanese decisions about where to strike next. It bought time. That time allowed American scouts to keep searching and finally locate Hiryu as she maneuvered to stay in the fight. Minutes and miles mattered. American commanders pushed their remaining dive bombers toward this last intact Japanese carrier before she could launch another wave. When they finally found Hiryu later in the day, she too was in the middle of turning aircraft around for another strike, with planes, fuel, and ordnance scattered across her decks and hangars. Bomb hits shattered her flight deck and set off fires that raged out of control through the exposed spaces below. By day's end, all 4 Japanese carriers committed to the operation were burning or sinking into the Pacific. The United States had lost Yorktown and many brave air crews, especially in the torpedo squadrons, but its remaining carriers and Midway itself still stood. What turned Midway was not a single bomb or torpedo. as dramatic as those moments were. It was the combination of codebreakers, early warning, a rushed repair job on Yorktown, the sacrifice of torpedo squadrons that drew Japanese fighters down low, the timing of the dive bombers, arrival from height, and Japanese indecision about how to arm their planes for island or fleet targets. Each piece shaped the others in a tight weave of cause and effect. Shift any one of those elements by an hour, or by a few miles of ocean, and the day might have ended very differently. That is the thin edge of chance in war. It can be terrifyingly narrow. When the sun went down on June 4th, and in the days that followed, as crippled ships were abandoned or scuttled, the immediate scoreboard at Midway was stark. Japan had lost 4 frontline fleet carriers and many of the skilled aviators who had led its early campaigns. The United States had lost Yorktown and 1 destroyer, along with heavy losses among its carrier air groups and Midway's defending squadrons. On paper, the Japanese fleet still possessed powerful battleships and other carriers that could steam and fight. In practice, the carefully trained carrier arm that had been built over many years had taken a blow it could never truly repair. Carrier hulls could be laid down in new shipyards and floated out to sea, but the veteran air groups lost at Midway were gone for good. Their mix of experience, doctrine, and shared practice could not be rebuilt quickly under wartime pressures. Strategically, this meant Japan would struggle to mount another deep, offensive carrier thrust into the Central Pacific on the scale of Pearl Harbor, or its early sweeping raids. The initiative began to shift in ways that were subtle at first but decisive over time. A long campaign was entering a new phase. In the months that followed Midway, the United States moved to contest the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, landing Marines on Guadalcanal and sparking a grinding series of sea and air battles. Those campaigns were hard, bloody, and often uncertain, but they unfolded in a Pacific where Japan no longer enjoyed an overwhelming carrier advantage. Each clash around Guadalcanal and in the surrounding seas played out against the background of the losses at Midway. The fight had changed shape. Now American industry, logistics, and growing combat experience could begin to tell. Midway did not end the war in the Pacific, yet it changed the direction of the tide. It turned what had looked like a seemingly unstoppable advance into a contest where time, production, and stubborn defense would steadily favor the United States and its allies. For modern readers and listeners, Midway still matters because it shows how intelligence, preparation, and the willingness to take calculated risks can reshape a conflict. It underlines the importance of repair crews as much as pilots, and of codebreakers as much as admirals. Small unit courage ties all of those strands together. Staff rides, war games, and studies of carrier warfare return again and again to this battle because it captures the shift from battleship-centered fleets to air power at sea and the thin line between disaster and opportunity when both sides are reaching for the initiative. When you look at photos of Midway's coral runways or the scarred flight decks of Enterprise and Hornet, you are seeing the places where a single day's choices changed the Pacific War's trajectory. You are also seeing the early outline of the post-war world that followed. One atoll and a ring of ships helped redraw global history. That is a powerful legacy. When we remember the Battle of Midway, we are really remembering code rooms, cramped engine spaces, and crowded ready rooms, as much as we remember explosions and burning decks. We are remembering how people under pressure used what they had, took real risks, and accepted heavy losses to change the course of a larger struggle. That human story sits behind every map of the battle and every diagram of the carrier formations. It gives the history weight. Headline Wednesday is developed by trackpads.com as part of Dispatch U.S. Military History Magazine.